Hi, my lovelies. Welcome. I'm Leah Stewart, and I'm so happy you're here with me today. Before we dive into this story, I need to tell you something important. Everything you're about to hear is pure fiction. The characters, the situations, the political scenarios, they all came from my imagination, from that place where I love to create worlds where love can bloom even in the darkest circumstances. Because that's what I do, you know? I create storms so you can see how beautiful it is when two souls become each other's shelter. And speaking of stories, if you're enjoying what we create here, I'd love to have you in our Patreon community. The first link in the description will take you there. It's a special place where you can support this work and get exclusive content, bonus chapters, and listen to all the stories ad-free on Spotify. It's my way of giving something extra to those who make this stream possible. But for now, get comfortable, and I promise you, it's going to make your heart race. Let's begin.
The rain fell as if the sky itself were grieving for him, because Jake Carrington no longer could. It was a cold, relentless downpour that plastered his dark hair to his skull and soaked through the shoulders of his worn leather jacket, but he didn't feel it. He didn't feel much of anything these days. He stood in the empty cemetery, a ghost among ghosts, the silence broken only by the drumming of rain on stone. 3 years. 3 years to the day since he had stood in this exact spot and watched them lower Marcus into the cold, unforgiving earth. 3 years since he had buried his partner, his brother, and the last good part of himself along with him. He had made a vow that day, a silent, brutal promise etched into his soul. He would never fail like that again. The phone in his pocket vibrated, a jarring intrusion into his private penance. He ignored it. It buzzed again, more insistent this time. He pulled it out, the screen slick with rain, and saw the words, "unknown number." He almost declined. Almost. But something, some lingering echo of the man he used to be, the man who always answered the call, made his thumb swipe to accept. Carrington. His voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse, like gravel grinding against stone. "Jake, it's George Miller." Jake closed his eyes, a muscle in his jaw tightening. Senator George Miller. Of course it was. The man had a politician's sixth sense for finding him at his weakest, for calling just when Jake wanted nothing more than to be forgotten by the world. He turned his back to the simple granite headstone, as if to shield his friend's memory from the compromise he was about to make. "Senator, with all due respect, if you're calling about a job, the answer is no." The pause on the other end of the line stretched for too long, filled only by the hiss of static and the sound of the storm. When Miller finally spoke, his voice was different. The polished, commanding tone of the senator was gone, replaced by the fractured whisper of a father. "My daughter almost died today." Jake froze, the cold rain suddenly feeling like ice against his skin. "The bombing at Hartley University," Miller continued, his voice trembling with the aftershock of a horror barely averted. "Grace was 200 yards from the epicenter. 200 yards, Jake. If she had left the library 2 minutes earlier." The senator's voice trailed off into a silence Jake knew all too well. It was the sound of a man who had just stared into the abyss and seen the face of someone he loved hanging over the edge. "I'm sorry to hear that, Senator, but there are security firms. I've tried them." Miller's voice was stronger now, but laced with a raw, desperate edge. "They gave me spreadsheets, statistics, 10-man teams with tactical gear. But not one of them could look me in the eye and guarantee me that my daughter will wake up alive tomorrow." "Senator, you're the last man I trust to keep someone alive, Jake." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Jake's gaze fell back to the headstone, the name carved into it a permanent accusation. Marcus Allen Reeves. Brother, soldier, friend. He couldn't keep Marcus alive. "Senator, Jake swallowed, the rain tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'm not in that line of work anymore. There's a reason for that. I know about Marcus." Miller's voice softened, becoming almost paternal, a calculated shift that grated on Jake's raw nerves. I know what happened in Kabul, and I know you carry it like it was your fault. It was my fault. The admission was a reflex, a truth he had lived with for 1,095 days. No, it was an impossible choice in a split second, and you chose to save 3 lives instead of 1. Miller took a deep, steadying breath. Marcus would have made the same choice. You know he would have. Jake squeezed his eyes shut, the rain on his face mixing with something hotter, something that felt dangerously like a tear. He hadn't cried in 3 years. He wouldn't start now. Please, Jake. The senator was gone again. This was just a father, stripped bare and begging. She's all I have, my only child, and they're going to try again. I know they are. Jake stood in the downpour, the world shrinking to the rain-slicked granite in front of him and the desperate voice in his ear. He had sworn off this life. He had promised himself he would never again hold someone else's life in his hands. But he also knew the sound of a man out of options. He had heard it in his own voice once. When do you need me? The question left his lips before he had consciously decided to ask it. The answer was immediate, a breath of pure relief. Now. The Miller mansion was exactly what Jake expected, an imposing fortress of stone and glass that loomed over its manicured lawns with cold, architectural arrogance. It was a place full of expensive furniture no one actually used, and rooms that echoed with a lonely, sterile silence. Senator Miller led him into the living room, a cavernous space with a fireplace large enough to stand in. A solitary figure was curled on the far end of a vast leather sofa. Grace Miller. She didn't look up when they entered. She was a small, huddled shape in the oversized room, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees as if holding herself together. She was still wearing the clothes from campus, ripped jeans and a gray university sweatshirt smudged with dust. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail that had started to come undone. She wasn't crying, but Jake recognized the look in her eyes when she finally, slowly, lifted her head. It was the hollow, 1,000-yard stare of someone who had just been forced to understand for the very first time that they were not immortal. Grace. The senator's voice was soft, hesitant, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. This is Jake Carrington. He's going to be staying with us for a while. Her eyes, intelligent and brown, finally flickered toward Jake. They were filled with a volatile mixture of fear and indignation. Dad, we already have security. Her voice was firm, but Jake heard the tremor running beneath the surface, the fine crack in the porcelain. I don't need another one. Jake isn't another security guard, honey. The senator looked at Jake, and the weight of a father's desperation was in his gaze. He's a former Navy SEAL. He served in operations I'm not even allowed to mention. If anyone can keep you safe, it's him. Grace's eyes settled on Jake then, really seeing him for the first time. He felt the assessment, the rapid-fire analysis as she took in his soaked jacket, the hard lines of his face, the unyielding set of his shoulders. He could see the question in her eyes. Was he a protector or just a more handsome jailer? I don't need a babysitter, Dad. She stood up, and despite the fear Jake knew was thrumming through her veins, her posture was pure defiance. I need my life back. Jake watched her, silent, letting the space fill with her challenge. He let her see the stillness in him, the quiet economy of motion that spoke more of danger than any threat could. Then, for the first time since entering the house, he spoke. His voice was calm, level, but it cut through the tension in the room like a razor. I'm not a babysitter, Miss Miller. Her eyes snapped to his. I'm the person who's going to make sure you have a life to go back to. She stared at him, and for a split second, something passed between them. A silent, unwilling acknowledgement. Neither of them wanted to be here. Both of them were trapped, She broke eye contact first, her shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly. "Fine," she muttered, the word heavy with exhaustion. And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jake and the senator in a heavy silence. Miller let out a long, ragged sigh. "She's scared," he said, the words sounding like an apology. Jake's gaze remained on the empty doorway through which Grace had disappeared. He could still feel the echo of her defiance, the brittle strength she was using as a shield. He recognized it. It was the anger that comes when you realize the world is not a safe place, when you are forced to live a life you did not choose. Protecting her from a bomber would be the easy part. "I know," he replied. Protecting her from the fear that was already starting to consume her. That would be the real battle. He took a slow breath, his senses expanding to fill the space. He noted the large glass windows facing the lawn, a sniper's dream, the multiple entry points, the way the silence of the house felt wrong, too quiet. He was already working. The job had already begun. As he started his initial sweep of the ground floor, moving with a silent purpose that made the senator take a step back, he found something no one else had noticed. Tucked under the back door, almost invisible against the dark wood of the threshold, was a plain white envelope. No stamp, no address. He picked it up, his fingers registering the crispness of the paper. Inside, a single sheet, a single sentence, printed in stark, block letters. "Tell Senator Miller his time is running out. Grace is next." Jake folded the note, his face a mask of stone. He slipped it into his inner jacket pocket, the paper a cold weight against his chest. He didn't show the senator. He didn't call out. The first rule of protection was absolute. Never let the target panic. And right now, everyone in this house was a target. Grace woke up with a predator in her room. That was her first thought, a primal jolt of terror that shot through her veins before she was even fully conscious. A dark silhouette stood in her doorway, motionless, just watching. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, a scream built in her throat, hot and sharp. She sat bolt upright, pulling the covers to her chin like a child's shield, the scream ready to tear loose. And then her sleep-fogged brain registered the shape, the broad shoulders, the unnerving stillness. Jake Carrington. The scream died, replaced by a surge of indignant fury. "What are you doing in my room?" Her voice came out higher than she intended, thin and brittle in the pre-dawn quiet. He didn't move from the doorway, a sentinel carved from shadows. His voice, when it came, was a low, dispassionate rumble that seemed to absorb the light in the room. "Checking exit routes. Your window gives direct access to the roofline of the West Wing. It's a primary vulnerability." Grace clutched the comforter tighter, suddenly, intensely aware that she was wearing nothing but an old, threadbare university t-shirt and shorts. She could feel his gaze sweeping the room, not with interest, but with a cold, clinical assessment that was somehow more invasive. "You can't just walk in here." "I can. And I will." He finally moved, stepping into the room with a silent, fluid grace that was unnerving. He walked to her window, his back to her, and tested the lock with an efficient mechanical precision. The click of the latch echoed in the silent room. From now on, there are rules. He turned to face her, and the first, weak light of dawn filtering through the window caught his face. For the first time, she saw his eyes clearly. They were blue, not a warm sky blue, but the cold, clear blue of glacial ice, hard, deep, unyielding. "Rule 1, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You go nowhere without notifying me. Rule 2, you don't open doors, windows, or accept packages. Rule 3, if I say get down, you get down. No questions." She stared at him, incredulous. The sheer unapologetic arrogance of it was breathtaking. "Are you serious?" A flicker of something, not amusement, but a deep, weary patience, passed through his eyes. Completely. The days that followed were a silent, suffocating war. Jake was her shadow, a constant, brooding presence that followed her from the gilded cage of the mansion to the sprawling, suddenly threatening grounds of the university. He was never more than 10 feet away. He never smiled. He never relaxed. He was a walking, breathing embodiment of her new reality, a constant reminder that her life was no longer her own. Grace tried to ignore him. She tried to pretend he was just part of the scenery, a piece of furniture. But it was impossible to ignore a man who seemed to take up all the oxygen in a room simply by existing. His presence was a physical weight, a low hum of controlled energy that set her teeth on edge. One afternoon, in the hushed, cathedral-like silence of the main library, she felt his presence before she saw him. The subtle shift in the air, the way a few heads turned. He appeared at her table, moving with that silent, predatory grace, and placed 2 steaming paper cups on the polished wood. He slid one toward her without a word. Grace stared at the cup as if it were a snake. Then she looked up at him. "I didn't order coffee." "I know." He took the seat opposite her, his large frame making the antique library chair look like a child's toy, those glacial blue eyes fixed on her. "You've been here for 4 hours. Your preferred drink is a vanilla latte, no extra sugar." A cold prickle of unease went down her spine, sharper than any fear she'd felt before. This was different. This was intimate. "How do you know that?" "It's my job to know." There was no pride in his voice, no arrogance. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the emotional warmth of a weather report. And in that moment, Grace understood. Jake Carrington wasn't just guarding her body, he was studying her. He was learning the rhythm of her life, the patterns of her habits, the small details that made her who she was. The thought was simultaneously the most comforting and the most terrifying thing she had ever known. That night, she woke again. But this time, it wasn't Jake's silent presence that pulled her from sleep. It was a sound, a sharp, shattering noise from downstairs. Her heart leaped into her throat. She slid out of bed, her bare feet silent on the thick carpet. The house was dark, wrapped in a deep, oppressive silence that felt wrong. She crept to her door, opening it a crack. The hallway was an inky black maw. "Jake?" she whispered, the sound swallowed by the darkness. No answer. Her blood ran cold. She moved down the grand staircase, every nerve screaming. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound deafening in the stillness. The living room was empty, moonlight painting silver stripes across the expensive rugs. The kitchen was a void. Then she saw it. The French doors leading to the back terrace were slightly ajar, a sliver of cold night air seeping in, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. "Jake!" she called again, her voice louder this time, laced with a panic she couldn't control. A hand clamped over her mouth from behind. A scream was choked off before it could form. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a wall of solid muscle. She struggled, a wild, frantic terror surging through her. "It's me!" The voice was a low, urgent growl in her ear, the breath hot against her skin. "Don't make a sound." "Jake." The relief was so absolute, so total, that her knees almost buckled. He held her steady, his body a shield behind hers. He guided her into the deeper shadows of the kitchen, pressing her back against the cool marble of the center island. She could feel the heat of his body seeping through her thin t-shirt, the controlled rise and fall of his chest against her back. "There's someone on the grounds," he whispered, his voice barely a vibration against her ear. "Stay low, and stay quiet." She trembled, not from cold, but from pure, unadulterated terror. He moved away from her for a fraction of a second, and she heard a soft, metallic slide. When he moved back into her line of sight, he was holding a gun. The moonlight glinted off the dark metal, and it looked like a natural extension of his hand. He moved through the kitchen with a silence that was terrifying in its own right, each step deliberate, a predator stalking its prey. Grace held her breath, watching him melt into the darkness near the open doors. She heard voices, low, muffled. A man's voice, then Jake's, a sharp, quiet command. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then he was back, appearing out of the shadows as silently as he had entered them. He was alone. The gun was gone, tucked back into the waistband at the small of his back. "It's over," he said, his voice still low. "One of your father's new security team, doing a late patrol." He dropped a terracotta pot. Grace let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The release of tension was so intense her legs finally gave way. Jake was there before she hit the floor, his hand shooting out to grip her elbow, his touch firm, steadying. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw a crack in the glacier. In the dim moonlight, she saw something beyond professional coolness in his eyes. It was concern. Real, undiluted concern. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He didn't let go. He kept his hand on her elbow, guiding her back up the stairs, his presence a solid, reassuring weight beside her. When they reached her bedroom door, he finally stopped. "Grace?" He waited until she looked at him, her eyes wide and dark in the dim hallway. "I promised your father I would keep you safe." His voice was low, intense, and it vibrated through her. "I don't break my promises." There was something in his eyes, a fierce, solemn vow that went far beyond a job description. It was a personal declaration, a piece of himself laid bare in the darkness, and it made her stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I know," she whispered, and she realized, with a startling certainty, that she did. The days that followed settled into a strange, tense rhythm. Jake remained her silent, ever-present shadow, a constant weight in her periphery. But something had shifted in the space between them since the night of the broken pot. The air was still thick with unspoken rules and the constant, low-grade hum of danger, but now there was something else too, a fragile, unacknowledged awareness. It started with the coffee. Every morning, like clockwork, he would appear. Whether she was in the library, the conservatory, or the small breakfast nook, he would find her. He'd approach with that silent, unnerving grace, place a steaming cup on the table before her, and retreat to his watchful post without a word. It was always a vanilla latte. Always the perfect temperature, always exactly as she liked it. It became a ritual, a silent conversation in a relationship devoid of words. It was a gesture so mundane, so normal that it felt utterly alien in the high-stakes drama her life had become. And it was starting to get under her skin. "Why do you do that?" The question slipped out one morning in the library, louder than she intended in the hallowed silence. He had just placed the cup on her desk, the rich aroma of espresso and vanilla cutting through the musty scent of old books. He paused, halfway through turning away, and looked at her as if the question made no sense. "Do what?" "This." She gestured at the cup, a wave of frustration washing over her. It wasn't just about the coffee. It was about everything. The silent watching, the unnerving knowledge of her habits, the way he had inserted himself into every corner of her life. "You don't have to be nice to me. You just have to keep me alive. That's the job, right?" He held her gaze for a long moment. The icy blue of his eyes seemed to thaw for a fraction of a second, revealing a depth she hadn't seen before. Something that looked almost human. "I'm not being nice," he said, his voice a low rumble that was for her ears only. "I'm being efficient. You study better when you're caffeinated. You're less distracted when you're not thinking about being hungry or uncomfortable. And when you're focused," he paused, his gaze intensifying, "you're a more predictable asset. It makes you easier to protect." It was a cold, logical, infuriatingly plausible explanation. It was the perfect bodyguard answer. But as he walked away to take his position by the towering bookshelves, Grace didn't believe a single word of it. They were walking across campus later that day, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the manicured lawns. Jake was a half step behind her, and to her left, his usual position, his head constantly scanning, his presence a familiar, solid weight. Grace was trying to focus on the upcoming midterm, on anything other than the man walking beside her, when she stopped dead. Her eyes were fixed on the window of a small, old-fashioned ice cream parlor across the street. Jake stopped instantly, his body tensing, his hand instinctively dropping to the spot on his hip where his weapon was concealed. His gaze swept the street, the rooftops, the passing cars, cataloging every potential threat with a speed and focus that was terrifying. Only when he was satisfied there was no immediate danger did he follow her line of sight. Inside the shop, a family was bathed in the warm, golden light. A father, a mother, and a little girl, maybe 6 years old, with a smear of chocolate ice cream on her chin. The mother was laughing as she gently wiped the girl's face with a napkin. The father was leaning back, capturing the moment with his phone, a look of pure, unadulterated adoration on his face. It was a scene of such simple, perfect happiness that it felt like a punch to the gut. "Grace?" Jake's voice was soft, pulling her back from the window, back from the memory. "What is it?" She blinked, the image fracturing, the warmth fading. She felt a flush of embarrassment, realizing she had been staring. "Nothing, I just—" The words caught in her throat, thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It was loss. A deep, aching loss for a life she barely remembered. Jake didn't push. He just waited, his presence a silent, steady anchor in the swirling current of her emotions. "I used to do that," she finally said, her voice a near whisper, her gaze still fixed on the shop. "When I was little. Before everything. My dad would take me for ice cream. Every Saturday. It was our thing." She gave a small, watery smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He always got chocolate. I always got vanilla. My mom used to say we were creatures of habit." The quiet ache in her voice was unmistakable. It was the sound of nostalgia laced with grief, the pain of remembering something precious that had been irrevocably lost. "Come on," Jake said, the words surprising them both. She turned to look at him. "What?" He didn't answer. He simply took her arm, his grip firm but gentle, and started walking across the street, his body a shield between her and the traffic. He opened the door to the ice cream parlor, a small bell chiming overhead, and guided her inside. "But this isn't on the schedule," she protested weakly, the scent of sugar and waffle cones overwhelming her senses. "I'm changing the schedule." Inside, the air was warm and sweet. The family she had been watching was just leaving, the little girl waving a sticky hand in their direction. Grace found herself smiling back, a real smile this time. She ordered a single scoop of vanilla with chocolate sauce. Jake ordered the exact same thing. It wasn't a question, it wasn't a choice he seemed to ponder. It was a simple act of solidarity, a quiet statement that said, "I'm with you in this." They sat at a small table in the corner. Jake, out of habit, took the seat with his back to the wall, his eyes never truly leaving the door, but his attention, she realized with a jolt, was entirely on her. "Tell me about before," he said, his voice quiet, encouraging. Grace stared down at her melting ice cream, tracing patterns in it with her spoon. "Before what?" "Before all of this." He made a vague gesture that encompassed the world outside the shop. The invisible threats, the security protocols, the weight of her father's name. It took her a long time to answer. When she did, her voice was distant, as if she were narrating a story about someone else entirely. "I was 8 when my dad became a senator. Before that, we were normal. We lived in a normal house in a normal suburb. I went to public school. I had sleepovers with my friends. My mom made pancakes on Sundays, and my dad taught me how to ride my bike in the park." She paused, taking a small bite of ice cream, but Jake doubted she tasted it. And after? He prompted gently. After, everything changed. She looked up at him, and he saw a profound, ancient loneliness in her young eyes. We moved into the mansion. There were security guards everywhere. I had to switch to a private school where everyone knew who my father was. No more sleepovers. No more trips to the mall alone. No more... She trailed off. No more living. Jake felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He knew what it was like to live in a cage, even a gilded one. "What about your parents?" he asked, though he could already guess the answer. "They started fighting. A lot." Her fingers tightened around the cold spoon. "My mom, she didn't agree with his politics. She said he was changing, that the power was changing him. I was 10. I didn't understand. I just heard the yelling late at night when they thought I was asleep. He didn't say anything. He just listened. He was good at that. One day, she just left. She kissed me goodbye, told me she loved me, but that she couldn't stay anymore." Grace's voice cracked, just for a second, a tiny fissure in her carefully constructed composure. "She called sometimes. Birthdays, holidays, but it got less and less. Eventually, I just stopped waiting for the phone to ring." She finally looked at him, her face raw with a vulnerability he had never seen. "You know the worst part? I don't even blame her. Sometimes I look at the life my father built, this fortress, and I think I'd run away too if I could." Jake's hand moved before his brain could stop it. He covered her hand on the table, his larger, calloused hand completely engulfing hers. The touch was firm, solid, an anchor. "You're not trapped, Grace." She let out a humorless laugh. "Aren't I? I have a bodyguard who follows me to the bathroom. People are trying to kill me. My father is still trying to control every aspect of my life." "No," Jake said again, his voice more forceful. "You're in danger. That's different from being trapped. Danger is temporary. When this is over..." He hesitated, then pushed forward. "When this is over, you can choose any life you want." "And you?" she asked, her voice soft. She turned her hand under his, her fingers tentatively lacing with his. The simple gesture sent a jolt through him. "When this is over, what do you choose?" Jake looked down at their joined hands. His, scarred and hardened from years of holding weapons, of carrying the weight of other men's lives. Hers, delicate and small, yet holding on with a surprising strength. "I don't think men like me get to choose," he said, the words tasting like truth in his mouth. "I think we just keep moving forward. That's sad. It's realistic." She squeezed his hand. "Well, when this is over, I want you to choose something. Something just for you. Not a mission, not redemption. Just something that makes you happy." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. He saw the woman who had grown up in a golden cage but refused to let her spirit be broken. The woman who mourned a living mother but still had the courage to care. The woman who was surrounded by danger but still found time to stop in front of an ice cream shop and remember how simple things used to be. And he realized, with an alarming, gut-wrenching clarity, that he might have already chosen her. The thought was so dangerous, so far outside the rigid lines of his control, that he pulled his hand back as if burned. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "We should go," he said, his voice once again cool, professional. The walls were back up, but as they walked out of the shop and back into the fading sunlight, he couldn't shake the feeling of her fingers laced with his. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that one of his rules, the most important one, had just been broken. Never get emotionally involved. It was too late. Grace woke to a hand on her shoulder. Not gentle. Urgent. She gasped, her body lurching from a deep sleep into instantaneous, heart-pounding alertness. Jake was leaning over her, a dark shape against the faint moonlight filtering through her window. His face was close, his blue eyes burning with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. "Get dressed. Something warm," he commanded, his voice a low, controlled growl that tolerated no argument. "We have 10 minutes. There was no room for questions. The sharp, diamond-hard edge in his tone told her everything she needed to know. Danger. Now. Move. Her body responded before her mind could catch up. She scrambled out of bed, her legs heavy with sleep, and fumbled for the first thing she could find: jeans, a thick wool sweater, hiking boots. The simple act of pulling on clothes felt clumsy, her fingers thick and uncooperative. By the time she stumbled downstairs, heart hammering against her ribs, Jake was already by the front door. A black duffel bag she'd never seen before was slung over his shoulder, and he held another, smaller one out to her. "Let's go," he said, opening the door not to the familiar driveway, but to the rear service entrance leading to the garage. A black, nondescript SUV she didn't recognize was already running, its engine a low, impatient thrum in the pre-dawn stillness. He opened the passenger door for her. "Get in." She obeyed without hesitation. Not because she was afraid of him, but because she realized with a startling jolt of clarity, she trusted him. Completely. The realization was as unnerving as it was absolute. Somewhere between the shared coffee and the silent understanding in the ice cream shop, a fundamental shift had occurred. Jake drove with a focused, lethal calm. No music, no explanations. Just the sound of the engine and the rhythmic click of his eyes darting from the road to the rearview mirror and back again, every 3 seconds, like a metronome counting down to something she couldn't see. Grace didn't ask where they were going. She just watched the familiar, opulent landscape of her neighborhood give way to highways, then to country roads, the world outside the window dissolving into a dark, speeding blur. 2 hours later, as the first hints of gray lightened the eastern sky, Jake turned onto a dirt road so overgrown and unmarked that Grace would have missed it entirely. "Where are we?" Her voice was a dry rasp. "Pennsylvania. Pocono Mountains." He navigated the rutted track with practiced ease, the dense trees closing in around them like a tunnel. "No one knows about this place. Not your father, not my team, no one." A strange feeling tightened in Grace's chest. It wasn't fear. It was something far more complex. It felt like relief. For the first time in weeks, she felt the suffocating weight of being watched begin to lift. Here, she wasn't the senator's daughter. She was just gone. The cabin emerged from the trees like a secret. It was small, built of dark, weathered logs, blending almost perfectly into the surrounding forest. There were no other lights, no other signs of life, just trees, sky, and a profound, unbroken silence. Jake cut the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening. "We'll stay here," he said, his voice low in the confines of the car. "Until I'm sure it's safe to go back." "How long?" she whispered. "I don't know." He finally turned to look at her, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. "Does that scare you?" Grace considered the question. Being here, alone with him, in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, completely cut off from the world. It should have been terrifying. "No," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her. "Should it?" A flicker of something warm and unguarded passed through his eyes before the mask slammed back into place. "No, not with me." The first few days were a study in strange, domestic tension. No phone calls from her father, no security patrols, no cameras tracking her every move. There was just Grace and Jake and the 4 walls of the small cabin. It was in this forced, quiet intimacy that she began to see him. Not the bodyguard, the man. She learned the rhythm of his days. He rose before dawn, his movements silent as he performed a series of punishing exercises on the porch, his breath pluming in the cold morning air. He checked every lock on every window and door before they went to bed, a nightly ritual performed with the solemnity of a prayer. She discovered, to her astonishment, that he could cook. Not just functional survivalist cooking, but eggs scrambled to perfection and coffee so strong and black it felt like a sin. And she learned that without the constant distractions of the outside world, it was impossible not to watch him. She watched the way he cleaned his gun at the kitchen table, his large, calloused hands moving with a delicate, focused precision, treating each component with a reverence that was both fascinating and terrifying. She noticed the way he would pause, almost imperceptibly whenever she entered a room, as if his entire being recalibrated to her presence, and she saw the way he never looked at her for too long, his gaze always skittering away as if looking directly at her might break some unspoken, self-imposed rule. On the third night, sleep wouldn't come. The silence of the forest pressed in on her, not the menacing silence of danger, but a deeper, more profound quiet that left her alone with her thoughts. And all her thoughts, she realized with a growing sense of panic, were about Jake. She padded downstairs, drawn by a thirst she couldn't quench. She expected to find the main room dark and empty. Instead, a single lamp cast a small pool of golden light on the sofa where Jake sat. He was holding a book, but he wasn't reading. His gaze was fixed on some distant point across the room, his expression lost and unguarded. Grace stopped at the bottom of the stairs, hidden in the shadows. There was a tension in his shoulders, a rigid set to his jaw that made her hesitate. He looked like a man haunted. He turned a page without seeing it, and she understood. He wasn't here, in this cabin. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark. Moving on silent feet, she went to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and found a box of chamomile tea, the only kind that had ever helped her sleep as a child. When she returned with 2 steaming mugs, the clink of ceramic against the wooden coffee table made him blink, as if waking from a trance. "You should be asleep," he said, but there was no reprimand in his voice, just a flat statement of fact. "So should you." She sat on the sofa, not too close, but close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, and handed him a mug. His fingers brushed against hers as he took it, a fleeting touch that sent a spark up her arm. Her eyes fell to the book in his lap. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed and soft with age. "What are you reading?" He looked down at the book as if he'd forgotten it was there. "Ah, this." He ran a thumb over the frayed spine. "It's not really my thing." "Then why are you reading it?" He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean in to hear it. "It was Marcus's favorite, my partner." He swallowed, a difficult, painful motion. He read it after every deployment, said it helped him remember that the world was more than just blood and ruins. Grace's heart ached for him. "After he died, I took it. I thought if I read it, maybe—" He stopped, his jaw working. "Maybe I'd understand why he thought all of this was worth fighting for." She glanced at the cover, some classic novel about hope and second chances. Exactly the kind of thing a man like Marcus would read. Exactly the kind of thing a man like Jake would see as a weakness. "And did you?" she asked softly. He let out a short, humorless laugh that was more like a cough. "No, it just made me feel worse. Because Marcus saw beauty in everything, and I—" He closed the book with a soft thud. "I only see flaws, vulnerabilities, ways to fail." Grace took a sip of her tea, letting the silence stretch, letting his confession settle in the space between them. Then she said something she hadn't planned. "Do you think Marcus would want to be remembered like that?" His head snapped toward her, his eyes sharp and questioning. "What do you mean?" "As a ghost," she said, her voice gaining strength. "As the reason you punish yourself. She put her mug down and turned to face him fully. You said he saw beauty in everything, right? So maybe he wouldn't want his memory to be the thing that stops you from living. He stared at her as if she'd just spoken in a foreign language. He died saving people, Jake. That's not your failure. She searched for the right word. That's who he was. A hero. And heroes don't want to be remembered as anchors, dragging people down with them. They want to be the reason people keep going. His breath hitched. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The muscles in his jaw worked furiously. I never thought of it that way, he finally managed, his voice raw at the edges. Maybe it's time you did. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Not as the senator's daughter, not as a job, but as Grace. How did you get so wise? He asked, and there was something dangerously close to awe in his voice. She shrugged, a small, self-deprecating smile touching her lips. I've had a lot of time alone to think. When you grow up in a cage, you learn to live inside your own head. He leaned back against the sofa, letting his head fall against the cushions. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since she'd met him, the tension seemed to drain from his body. He didn't look like a soldier or a bodyguard. He just looked tired, human. And Grace, unable to help herself, let her eyes wander. They traced the hard, clean line of his jaw, so defined it looked like it had been carved from granite. Her fingers tingled with the absurd, sudden urge to touch it, just to see if it was as unyielding as it looked. Her gaze dropped lower to the way his dark, long-sleeved shirt stretched across the broad expanse of his chest. It was a simple, functional piece of clothing, but on him, it was a study in contained power, hinting at the years of ruthless training that had sculpted the muscles beneath. A slow, unfamiliar heat bloomed in her stomach and crept up her neck. Stop it, she commanded herself. He's your bodyguard. This is insane, inappropriate. But then he sighed, a low, weary sound, and the slight expansion of his chest under the fabric made her have to look away, her eyes fixing on her own mug as if it held the secrets of the universe. When was the last time she had felt this? This sharp, unnerving awareness of another person's physical presence? The way her own body seemed to react to him, her heart rate quickening, her skin prickling with an energy that had nothing to do with fear. Never, she realized with a dizzying certainty. She had never felt this before. It was terrifying. It was dangerous. And it was utterly, completely wrong. He opened his eyes, and they were fixed on her. The weariness was still there, but it was mingled with something else now. Something softer. Something open. And her stomach did a slow, lazy flip that had nothing to do with terror and everything to do with him. Thank you, he said, his voice a rough whisper. For what? For seeing Marcus. Not the ghost I made him. She had to swallow before she could speak, because the space between them on the sofa suddenly felt both too small and vast as a canyon. You're welcome. He kept looking at her, not the quick, assessing sweep she was used to, but a deep, steady gaze, as if he were trying to memorize her face. And Grace, caught in the pull of it, looked back. She saw the tiny, faded scar above his left eyebrow she'd never noticed before. She saw the way the lamplight turned the blue of his eyes to a deep, stormy gray. She saw his lips, usually pressed into a firm, unyielding line, were slightly parted, soft, almost vulnerable. The silence shifted again. It grew heavy, charged. He blinked first, his gaze dropping away as if he'd touched a hot stove. The walls were back up. You should get some sleep, he said, his voice rougher than before. Grace nodded, not trusting her own voice. She stood, picking up her empty mug. As she walked past him toward the kitchen, her fingers brushed against his shoulder. It was the lightest of touches, an accident of proximity. But she felt it like a brand, a jolt of pure, undiluted electricity. And by the way, his entire body went rigid, the muscles under his shirt coiling like springs. She knew, with terrifying certainty, that he had felt it too. "Good night, Jake," she managed to say, her voice surprisingly steady. "Good night, Grace." She was halfway up the stairs when she heard him exhale, a long, slow, controlled breath. The sound a man makes when he is fighting a war with himself and losing. The fragile truce they had forged in the dead of night, over chamomile tea and shared ghosts, held for 2 more days. They existed in a state of suspended animation, a quiet domestic dance of shared spaces and unspoken thoughts. The air in the cabin remained thick with a new, palpable tension. The memory of his confession about Marcus, the ghost of her touch on his shoulder. They were acutely aware of each other in a way that went far beyond the professional roles of protector and protected. It was dangerous territory, and they both knew it. They were sitting on the porch as the sun bled through the trees in strokes of orange and purple, painting the sky in bruised, beautiful colors. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth. Jake was performing his ritualistic maintenance on his Sig Sauer, his hands moving with a familiar, hypnotic grace as he disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled the weapon. It was a process so ingrained in him it seemed as meditative as it was mechanical. Grace watched the fluid, precise movements of his hands, the same hands that had held hers in the ice cream shop, the same hands that had gripped her shoulder with such steadying force. She broke the comfortable silence, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. "Did you always want to be a soldier?" His hand stilled for a fraction of a second, a tiny falter in the otherwise perfect rhythm. He looked up from the slide of the pistol, his eyes meeting hers across the small space. "No," he said, the word surprisingly soft. "I wanted to be an architect." Grace blinked, the answer so unexpected it felt like a non sequitur. "Really?" A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. "Really? I loved drawing buildings when I was a kid. Straight lines, solid structures. Everything made sense on paper." "What changed?" she asked, leaning forward, genuinely intrigued by this glimpse into the man he might have been. The smile vanished. He returned his focus to the gun, the pieces clicking back into place with finality. "My older brother enlisted. He was killed in an ambush in Iraq when I was 19. He paused, his hands still. "I signed up 3 months later." The weight of the confession settled between them, heavy and cold. "You wanted revenge?" she asked softly. "I wanted purpose," he corrected, his voice flat. He finished reassembling the pistol and set it aside, the movement deliberate. "I thought if I could save other families from what mine went through, maybe his death would mean something." "And did it?" He finally looked at her again, and in the fading light, she saw a raw vulnerability in his eyes that made her own heart ache. "I don't know. I saved a lot of lives. I lost a lot too." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "In the end, I'm not sure I made any difference at all." An almost overwhelming urge to reach out, to touch his hand, to offer some small comfort, surged through her. But before she could move, before she could break the invisible barrier between them, the sharp, jarring ring of his satellite phone shattered the moment. He answered, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant. The vulnerable man was gone, replaced by the cold, efficient soldier. His face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "When?" A pause, his jaw tightening. "How close?" Another, longer pause. "Understood. Activate Protocol Delta." He snapped the phone shut and was on his feet in one fluid, explosive motion. "What is it? What happened?" Grace asked, scrambling to her feet, the familiar, sickening grip of fear tightening in her stomach. "They found us." Jake was already moving, a whirlwind of controlled, purposeful action. He grabbed the pre-packed duffel bags, checked the load on 2 pistols, his movements economical and terrifyingly fast. "We have 20 minutes, maybe less." Grace froze, her mind going blank with panic. The cabin, their safe house, their tiny island of peace, had been breached. "Grace." He was suddenly in front of her, his hands gripping her shoulders, his touch firm, grounding her. "Look at me." She forced her eyes to meet his. The glacial blue was now burning with a fierce, focused light. "I will not let anything happen to you. Do you understand me?" His voice was a low, intense command that vibrated through her. "But you have to trust me. Completely." She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "Good." His grip tightened for a second, a silent promise. "Now get your bag, we're leaving." They didn't use the door. Jake led her to a trap door hidden beneath a rug in the main room, revealing a dark, narrow space. "It's a root cellar," he explained, his voice all business. "Leads to a tunnel. I dug it the first day we got here, just in case." The tunnel was claustrophobic, smelling of damp earth and fear. Grace followed him blindly, one hand clutching the back of his jacket, his solid form the only thing she could focus on in the suffocating darkness. When they finally emerged, gasping in the cold night air, they were nearly a quarter-mile from the cabin, hidden in a thicket of trees. A second, identical SUV was concealed under a camouflage tarp. He helped her in, then paused, looking back in the direction of the cabin, now invisible through the dense woods. "Jake?" she called, her voice trembling. "What's wrong?" "They shouldn't have found this place." His voice was dangerously quiet, controlled in a way that was more frightening than any shout. "No one knew we were here. Not your father, not my team. No one." A cold dread, worse than anything she'd felt before, crept down her spine. "What are you saying?" He turned to face her, and in the stark moonlight, his face was a mask of cold fury. There was something wild and dangerous in his eyes now. "I'm saying someone on the inside is feeding them information." "Who?" "I don't know yet." He slid into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life. "But I'm going to find out." They drove in a tense, suffocating silence. Grace watched him, saw the obsessive way he checked the mirrors, the hard set of his jaw, the constant scanning motion of his eyes. An hour later, he pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a run-down, forgotten motel on the side of a deserted highway. The flickering neon sign read, "Vac NCY." "One room," Jake grunted at the sleepy night clerk, slapping cash on the counter. "One night." The clerk handed over a key without a second glance. The room was small, smelled faintly of bleach and desperation, and contained a single double bed and a worn-out armchair. Jake locked the door, bolted the chain, and wedged the armchair under the knob. He checked the window lock twice before pulling the grimy curtains shut, plunging the room into near darkness. He finally turned to her, his face grim. "You take the bed. I'll take the floor." Grace was too exhausted, too emotionally drained to argue. She collapsed onto the lumpy mattress, not even bothering to take off her boots. But as she lay there, staring at the water-stained ceiling, sleep felt a million miles away. She listened to Jake's movements in the dark. She heard the soft rustle of him settling, not on the floor, but in the corner, his back against the wall, facing the door. She heard the quiet metallic click of the safety being disengaged on his pistol. "Jake, you don't have to." "Sleep, Grace." His voice was a soft, rough command from the darkness. "I'm on watch." And cocooned in the sound of his steady breathing, with the knowledge that he was awake and armed just a few feet away, Grace, against all odds, finally felt her eyes drift shut. She woke hours later, disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness. The room was silent, too silent. The steady rhythm of Jake's breathing was gone. She sat up, her heart instantly pounding. "Jake!" A floorboard creaked by the window. He was standing there, a tall silhouette against the thin, cheap curtains, looking out through a tiny gap. But he wasn't watching the parking lot. He was holding a phone. Her phone. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice a fearful whisper. He turned slowly. His face was unreadable in the darkness, but when he spoke, his voice was stripped of all warmth, all connection. It was as cold and hard as the steel of his gun. "Why, Grace?" he asked, the words dropping into the silence like stones. "Do you have encrypted messages from an unknown number on your phone? I can explain." The words tumbled out of Grace's mouth, a reflexive, desperate defense before her mind had even caught up. The air in the small, stale motel room crackled with accusation. Jake hadn't moved from the window, a towering, judgmental silhouette against the sickly orange glow of the parking lot lights. "Then explain." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice he used to issue commands, to assess threats. It was not the voice of the man who had told her about his brother, who had shared a moment of quiet grief with her in the cabin. That man was gone. Grace swung her legs off the bed, her bare feet hitting the cold, worn carpet. Her body trembled, a combination of fear, exhaustion, and a new, sharp indignation. I started getting them a few months ago, before the bombing, before any of this." What kind of messages? He still hadn't moved, his stillness a form of pressure, forcing the truth from her. Someone telling me my father was lying to me, that he wasn't the man I thought he was. She swallowed, her throat dry. I thought it was just some crank, a political nut job. I ignored them. But you didn't delete them. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. No, How could she explain the complicated mess of her feelings, the lifetime of quiet doubts about her father, the man of secrets and shadows? Part of me wanted to believe it was all lies, but another part, a small traitorous part, wondered if it was true. He finally moved, crossing the small room in 2 silent strides. He didn't loom over her. He simply stood before her and held out his hand, palm up. The command was implicit. He held her phone out to her. "Show me." With trembling fingers, she took the phone, the familiar weight of it feeling alien in her hand. She unlocked it, her thumbprint barely registering, and navigated to the encrypted messaging app she had downloaded out of a morbid curiosity she now deeply regretted. She handed the phone back to him. He took it, his eyes scanning the screen, the only light in the room reflecting off his face, making him look like a stone carving. Grace watched him read, her heart pounding with each passing second. There were 5 messages in total, each one a small poisonous dart. "Your father is not the hero he pretends to be. He has secrets that could destroy you. You are in danger, but not from who he says. The university bombing? He knew it was coming. Find the truth before it's too late." Jake read each one in a profound, unnerving silence. His expression didn't change, but she could feel the temperature in the room drop several degrees. When he finally looked up, his eyes were chips of ice. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "Because I didn't know if I could trust you." The words burst out of her, fueled by weeks of fear and paranoia. "You work for him. He hired you. For all I knew, you were part of whatever this is." He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She saw a war happening behind his eyes, a clash of protocol and something else, something personal. Then, almost imperceptibly, something in his expression shifted. The hard, accusatory edge softened, replaced by a weary, complicated understanding. "Grace." He took a step closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the small space. "My job is to protect you, not your father, not his political interests. You." "How can I be sure?" she whispered, the question a genuine plea. He reached out, his hand coming up to cup her chin. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his thumb stroking softly against her skin as he tilted her face up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Because if I were working against you, he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that vibrated straight through her. You'd already be dead. The brutal, unequivocal honesty of the statement hit her like a physical blow. It was terrifying. It was horrifying, and in the twisted logic of her new life, it was the most reassuring thing anyone had ever said to her. It was a truth as hard and real as the man standing before her. Then help me, she whispered, the fight draining out of her, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion. Help me find out the truth, about my father, about all of it. He held her gaze for another second before letting his hand drop, breaking the connection. He paced the small room, a caged tiger, the contained energy radiating from him. If we go down this road, you might not like what we find. I know. He stopped, studying her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, he gave a single, sharp nod. Fine, but from now on, no more secrets. Not from either of us. No more secrets, she agreed, the words feeling like a vow. By morning, the motel room had transformed into a makeshift command center. Jake, hunched over a sleek military-grade laptop that seemed to appear out of nowhere, worked with a silent, focused intensity. He was trying to trace the origin of the encrypted messages, his fingers flying across the keyboard in a language Grace didn't understand. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and unspoken tension. Hours passed. Grace watched him, fascinated and a little afraid. This was him in his element, not the silent shadow, not the reluctant confidant, but the hunter. Finally, his laptop emitted a soft, single beep. Got it. His voice was flat, but Grace could see the tightness around his eyes. He didn't sound triumphant. He sounded disturbed. What is it? She asked, moving to stand behind him, peering at the screen. He turned the laptop so she could see. A string of code resolved into a location, an IP address, and finally, a name. The messages originated from inside your father's own security office, he said, his voice grim. From a computer assigned to someone on his internal staff. Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Who? A man named Diaz. The name hit her like a punch. Ryan Diaz. But he's my father's right-hand man. He's been with him for over a decade. She thought of the kind, balding man who always had a smile for her, who slipped her candy when her father wasn't looking when she was a little girl. It didn't make sense. Jake slowly closed the laptop. And now he's sending you anonymous warnings about his own boss. Why? What could he possibly gain? I don't know. Jake stood, grabbing his leather jacket. The easygoing man from the cabin was completely gone, replaced by a cold, hard-edged stranger. You stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Where are you going? She asked, a new fear coiling in her stomach. He paused at the door, turning to look at her. The intensity in his gaze was a physical force, pinning her in place. I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. Diaz. He was gone for 3 hours. 3 hours that stretched into an eternity. Grace paced the small room, jumped at every sound, imagined 1,000 terrible scenarios. When the knock finally came, 3 sharp, precise raps, their agreed-upon signal, she nearly sobbed with relief. She threw the door open. What happened? Did you talk to him? Jake stepped inside, locking the door behind him. He leaned back against it, his face pale under his tan, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. It wasn't Diaz, he said, his voice a rough, hollowed-out rasp. What do you mean? He looked at her, and she saw something broken in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before he left. Someone got to him first. He was murdered, 2 hours before I arrived. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Single gunshot to the back of the head, professional execution. Grace covered her mouth with her hand, a wave of horror and nausea washing over her. Diaz, kind, smiling Diaz, dead. Jake. He pushed himself off the door, his movements stiff. Whoever is behind this, Grace, they're cleaning up loose ends. He looked at her, and the raw, protective fury in his eyes was terrifying and comforting all at once. And I need to find out who they are before you're the next one. She couldn't stop shaking. Even after a scalding hot shower that left her skin red, even after Jake had methodically checked every lock and peered out every window, assuring her in that low, steady voice that they were safe for now, the tremors continued. They started deep inside her, a seismic reaction to the news. Diaz was dead. The fact of it was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. He had a family. He had tried to warn her. And now, he was gone. The world felt thin, brittle, like it could shatter at any moment. You need to eat. Jake's voice cut through her daze. He placed a white paper bag leaking the greasy, savory scent of Chinese takeout on the small, scarred table. Grace stared at it, her stomach churning. I'm not hungry. Grace. He had a family, she interrupted, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. She looked up at him, her eyes burning. A daughter. She's 8 years old. Jake hesitated, the professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second, revealing the man beneath. He knew what that meant. He knew the cost. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back finally spilled over, hot and sharp against her cold skin. And now she doesn't have a father. Because of me. No. He was across the room in 2 strides, his large frame suddenly filling her vision. He knelt in front of her, bringing himself to her level. The intensity in his eyes was a physical force. Not because of you, because of whoever is pulling these strings. But he was trying to warn me, she choked out, a sob tearing through her. He was trying to protect me, and he died for it. Listen to me. He reached out, his hands framing her face. His palms were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle, his thumbs stroking away her tears. He forced her to meet his gaze. Diaz made a choice. He chose to warn you because it was the right thing to do. Don't let his death be for nothing by shutting down now. The dam broke. A raw, ragged sob escaped her, and before she could think, before she could stop herself, she was lurching forward, her hands grabbing the front of his shirt, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving into chaos. And Jake, who lived by a code of professional distance, Jake, who kept the entire world at arm's length, didn't push her away. He didn't stiffen. He pulled her in. His arms came around her, strong and sure, enveloping her completely. One hand spread wide across her back, holding her steady, while the other moved to the back of her head, his fingers tangling gently in her damp hair. He held her against his chest, and she buried her face in the crook of his neck, inhaling the scent of leather and clean soap and something that was just him. You've got me, he murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration against her ear. I promise, you've got me. They stayed like that for a long time, the world shrinking to the circle of his arms. The takeout grew cold on the table. The sounds of the highway outside faded into a distant hum, and in the quiet, desperate space between them, something shifted. Something broke. When Grace finally pulled back, her storm of tears had subsided, leaving behind a bruised, aching calm. I'm sorry, she whispered, her face hot with embarrassment. Don't be. His voice was hoarse, deeper than usual. He hadn't let go. His hands were still resting on her shoulders, his thumbs stroking small, soothing circles against her collarbones. She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the way his gaze was searching her face, as if memorizing every detail. She saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, the only sign of the tension he held in check. Jake, she started, but she didn't know how to finish. Thank you. I'm scared. Don't let go. He seemed to understand anyway. Because the space between them, already so small, was shrinking. He was leaning in. Or maybe she was. Or maybe the gravity in the room had simply shifted, pulling them inexorably together. His eyes dropped to her lips. Her breath caught in her throat. His head tilted, his own lips parting slightly. She could feel his breath on her skin, warm and unsteady. This was it. A line was about to be crossed. A rule was about to be shattered. And then his phone rang. The sound was a gunshot in the silent room. They flinched back simultaneously, the spell broken, the air suddenly charged with a different kind of tension, awkward and electric. Jake pulled his phone from his pocket, his expression instantly hardening, the professional mask slamming back into place. Carrington. A pause. When? Another, longer pause. Understood. Keep me updated. He ended the call and looked at Grace. Whatever had almost happened between them was gone, buried deep beneath layers of duty and control. That was your father, he said, his voice flat. He wants to see you. They agreed to meet on neutral ground, a quiet, family-style restaurant in a small town 2 hours away. Jake insisted on arriving an hour early, his focus absolute. He walked the perimeter, mapped out every exit, his eyes scanning every face, every car, his senses on high alert. When Senator Miller finally arrived, he looked like a man who had aged a decade in a week. His shoulders were slumped, his expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame, and there were dark, bruised circles under his eyes. "Gracie," he said, his voice rough, using a childhood nickname she hadn't heard in years. A part of her, the little girl who remembered Saturday ice cream trips, wanted to run to him. But the other part, the woman who now knew about Diaz, stayed rooted to the spot. Dad. They sat at a booth in the back corner. Jake stood 10 feet away, a silent, watchful statue. "I was so worried," Miller began, his hand trembling as he reached for hers across the table. Grace pulled her hand back. "You put a tracker on me." The senator blinked, taken aback. "To protect you, or to control me?" "Grace, whatever Carrington told you, it wasn't Jake." She leaned forward, her voice low and sharp. "It was Diaz, before he was murdered." The color drained from her father's face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. I didn't know about Diaz. You didn't know he was dead? Or you didn't know he was sending me warnings about you?" Miller glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "We need to talk, but not here, not with him listening." He flicked his eyes toward Jake. A hot, white-hot anger flared in Grace's chest. "If you have something to say to me, you can say it in front of him. He saved my life more times than I can count in the last week." "Grace, you don't understand. Then make me understand." Her voice rose, sharp and clear, turning heads at nearby tables. Her father took a deep, shuddering breath. "The terrorists," he said, his eyes darting around the room. They're not what you think they are." A cold premonition slid down her spine. "What does that mean?" He looked down at his hands on the table. "It means the situation is more complicated than I let on." "Complicated how?" But before he could answer, Jake was at their table, his body a rigid wall of tension. "We need to leave. Now." "What?" Grace started. "Now." The raw, absolute command in his voice left no room for argument. He grabbed her arm, pulling her from the booth, already moving them toward the kitchen, toward the back exit he had scouted earlier. And that's when she heard it. The distinct, sickening sound of shattering glass. A collective gasp from the other diners. Screams. And then, an earth-shattering explosion that blew the world apart. The force of the blast threw them forward. Grace felt a moment of weightlessness, the roar of the explosion consuming all sound, all thought. Then she was on the floor, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning chemicals. Her ears were ringing, a high-pitched, painful whine. Jake was on top of her, his body a solid, living shield, protecting her from the rain of debris. He was shouting something, his mouth moving, but she couldn't hear a word over the ringing in her ears. He was hauling her to her feet, his arm a steel band around her waist, dragging her through the chaos. People were running, screaming. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. When they finally stumbled out the back door into the cool, clean air, Grace saw the devastation. The entire front half of the restaurant was gone, replaced by a gaping, smoking maw. She twisted in Jake's grip, her eyes frantically searching the wreckage. "My father!" The booth where he had been sitting no longer existed. There was only rubble and dust and rising smoke. "Dad!" she screamed, trying to run back inside, but Jake's arms were like iron holding her back. "Grace! No! My father!" she shrieked, fighting him, her fists beating uselessly against his chest. He spun her around, his hands gripping her face, forcing her to look at him. There was a gash on his forehead, blood trickling down into his eyebrow, but his eyes were clear, focused, burning with a desperate intensity. "Grace, listen to me. I need you to trust me. We have to go. Now." "But my dad..." "Your dad has his own security, and paramedics are on the way. If we stay here, you die. Do you understand?" She stared at him, her vision blurred by tears, the world a dizzying, horrifying mess. She nodded, a single jerky motion. He pulled her toward the SUV. As they sped away, the last thing she saw in the rearview mirror was a kaleidoscope of red and blue flashing lights descending on the ruins, a swarm of fireflies rushing toward a fire that had already consumed everything. Her father was in there. Somewhere. Alive or dead, she didn't know. This story continues in part 2. And look, what Jake is about to discover will change absolutely everything. Every truth, every lie, every single moment they've lived until now. Because sometimes, the people we love most are exactly the ones who keep the most devastating secrets. See you in part 2, where nothing will be as you imagine.